Hello and welcome to all of you. My name is Larry Romero and I serve as the Product Marketing Manager at CPP for both the MBTI and the Strong Interest Inventory Assessment. CPP is a global publisher and provider of innovative products and services supporting individual, team, and organizational development. In addition to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and the Strong Interest Inventory tools, CPP assessment portfolio includes the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, the FIRO-B, and the CPI 260 assessments, all of which can supplement one another for better addressing your needs. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Increasing Employee Engagement and Retention Using the MBTI and Strong Instrument. The format for our session is set up so that the presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, allowing 15 minutes to address your questions immediately after. Please submit your questions via the questions box on the right side of your screen. Questions can be submitted throughout the session, and we will do our best to address as many as possible. A copy of the slide deck will be sent to all attendees. In addition, a recording of today's webinar will be posted to cpp.com. Now let's get started. Today's speaker is Dr. Jeff Prince. Jeff Prince is the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at the University of California, Berkeley. He has over 25 years of experience working in the field of counseling and career development. A licensed psychologist from the University of Minnesota, he is a former president of the International Association of Counseling Services, as well as a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Jeff has authored and co-authored several books and countless articles for a wide array of professional publications on counseling, assessment, and career development. Furthermore, he covers this topic on a regular basis at various professional events. I am excited to have Dr. Prince here with us today to share his insights on how to increase employee engagement and retention. Jeff, welcome.
Well, thank you, Larry, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this webinar on increasing employee engagement and retention using the Myers-Briggs and the Strong. I'd like to start by just providing an overview of, and of course the slide is not going forward, interestingly. Let me try, sorry about this. There we go. An overview of what I'll be covering.
Hi, Jeff, real quick. I'm sorry, I think everybody's saying they're having a little bit trouble hearing. If you can just a little bit louder.
Okay. Not sure what that's about. Kara, is this okay?
I think that sounds better. Let's see what has to say.
Okay, let me know, otherwise I'll switch to another setting, another phone.
I think everybody's saying it sounds okay. You're good to go. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Love technology. So let me provide an overview of what I'll be covering today. First, I'll be talking about what do we know about employee engagement and retention. So what does the literature show us? And I think this will help ground why we'd be using assessment tools to help with this. Then I'll be providing a brief overview of both the Strong Interest Inventory and the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory. Now, my guess is that some of you may be quite familiar with both of these inventories. Many of you may be somewhat familiar with the Myers-Briggs because it's so common and so widely used in both the career development and human resources. And my guess is also that many of you may be less familiar with the Strong Interest Inventory. So I'll be spending a little bit more time giving a review of that, just in case you're not familiar with it at all. Then I'll be moving into a case study to talk about how you actually can use both of these tools to help an employee who's unmotivated sort of gain more motivation in their work and feel more engaged. I'll also review a little bit about one particular company that's used the same approach for all employees as a career development tool. And then, as Larry said in the introduction, we'll be leaving about 15 minutes or so for audience questions, so there should be plenty of time for discussion. Okay, so what do we know about engagement and retention? Well, certainly there's been a lot of research in this area, and my guess is that many of you, because you tuned into this webinar, feel it's an important topic. And the research really does demonstrate very clearly that engagement is critical. It's critical because most people, if they're engaged, stay in their jobs. There's a lower turnover rate. There's less absenteeism. There's more productivity. And from the corporate end or the organization's end, there's higher profitability. And so I list one study here with some data, but that's just one example of so many that are out there. The question really is, how do we influence engagement and retention? And to do that, we can focus on influencing either one or both of the following. We can work on the work environment, or we can work on the individual. Both are critical. So let me go back to a theory of work adjustment, which is probably the primary theory that sort of underlies most career development efforts in organizations. And this theory basically has two components. The box on the left describes individual characteristics, that is the employee and what they need, what they're interested in, what they value, what skills they bring to the table. And on the right, the work environment characteristics. What's the organizational culture? What's the leadership style of the manager? What's the reward structure? And the theory is that basically, if the individual's characteristics and their needs, interests, and values match with the work environment characteristics of the organizational culture, then that leads to both engagement, satisfaction, and retention. So in other words, an individual might have a need for autonomy or a need for achievement. If the work environment has a culture that allows for that and provides for that, that individual is more likely to be engaged and satisfied and to stay with the job, right? Similarly, if the work environment is getting from the individual those skills and interests and that actually fit the culture and fit the reward structure, then they're going to basically have an employee who's happier and is staying there. So from an employee or an individual side, often the engagement is what they're interested in, and from the work environment side, often retention is what the employer is interested in. So there's two parts, the left and the right, the individual and the work environment. And I would say most of the literature and many efforts in human resources and career development often focus on the work environment part of that model. That is, there's a lot of effort that goes into leadership training, for example. How do we train leaders and managers to engage and retain employees through effective leadership styles or management styles? There's also effort on looking at the organizational climate. How do we change a climate so that employees are actually actively involved in decisions? They feel part of the culture. Or how do we create more transparent communication vehicles so that the whole organization is being transparent in what's happening and employees are feeling a part of it? Another way is, how do we build a fun environment, so kind of like the Google environment or many of the high-tech companies? Do we put a basketball court there so people are having fun and don't want to leave the place? Do we have good food there? So the organizational climate focus is another big area. And certainly the reward structure. How do we create organizations that have rewards such as salary, bonuses, professional development time that reward the behavior we're trying to get from employees? So those are all efforts that we can make toward the work environment. And there's a lot of work in human resources and career development that focuses on that end of the model. What I'll be focusing on, however, here is the individual focus, the other part of it, because both are important. And to have further engagement, it's critical that we look at the individual. And there are a number of studies out there, and my guess is many of you in the audience are working from an individual perspective, so this is nothing new. But this is where assessment comes in. A recent study, for example, found that nothing engages workers more than making progress in meaningful work. And that comes up again and again in studies that have been done. People want to be in jobs that are meaningful. Employees are motivated by jobs that challenge them, that let them grow and learn, and often are demoralized by those that are monotonous or lead to a dead end. There's also a lot of attention on the millennial workforce. We have this new group of people who've been coming into the workforce and will continue coming in until 2020 or so. And a lot of research has been asking and looking at, is this a really different cohort that really will get engaged in their jobs through a different method or stay in jobs according to different criteria? And as much as I don't like to stereotype generational differences, I have to agree that there are some data out there that say there's something a little bit different, but the reality is more is the same. In fact, 80% of the millennial workforce tend to believe that career should bring enjoyment and fulfillment, and they want a career that aligns with their passions. It's no different from previous cohorts. In fact, most millennials from surveys that have been done equate a successful career with doing meaningful work. It keeps coming up again and again. Here's a quote from a recent survey, for example. For me, being happy in a career means participating in worthwhile and meaningful work that benefits others and allows me to pursue my own interests. Okay? So how do we engage and retain employees? Well, individuals, all of us, want help in connecting our jobs to careers that relate to our personal passions. And that's where assessment tools can be helpful, because they do just that. Using assessment tools such as the Strong or the Myers-Briggs actually help on this individual box on the left-hand side of that model. They help us to clarify, to label, and to prioritize individual characteristics that create passion for one's work. So we use assessment tools to identify, for example, what interests you. What are the domains, the content of the job you're going to be doing? They also help us identify our needs and our values, so that what is more important to us? Is it more important for us to be working at a job that allows us to achieve or be recognized? Or is it more important for us, for example, to be at a job that provides security? Helping us prioritize those needs and values is a critical aspect of assessment. Similarly, looking at our personality styles and our preferences of how we go about our day-to-day work. Identifying that, labeling it, and being able to then identify work environments that match that is critical. So today, we're focusing on two classic tools, the Strong Interest Inventory and the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, that will help us do just that. Now, the Strong is really an inventory that looks at the content of one's work primarily. It helps identify what are your personal interests and matches them to jobs that are likely to be motivating and rewarding. In other words, it will help us look and help employees to say, what kind of work will be fulfilling for me? What domain, what content area? Whereas the Myers-Briggs actually looks at sort of the process. It helps individuals understand how they interact with others and how to work in ways that will tap your passion. So it looks at how you go about your work, whereas the Strong looks at what content area of work you might be in. And so each of those provide a critical aspect to satisfaction and engagement. But when you put them together, you actually get a more full model of both the content and the process. So let me give you a brief review of the Strong Interest Inventory. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you can also write questions if you like in the box there, but if I'm being too basic for you and you have particular questions. But for those of you who don't know it, I want to provide at least a basic overview, because we'll be dealing with this more later in the presentation. The Strong is really developed around a particular personality theory, John Holland's theory. And the theory is that there are 6 different kinds of people and 6 different kinds of work environments. And all of us are combinations of all 6 types, but it's important for us to be able to identify what 2 or 3 types are most similar to us, so that we can identify what work environments will match our type. So for the 6 types are listed here. Realistic are people who like to do things. They like to have hands-on kind of activities, action-oriented. Investigative types are the thinkers. They like to be in jobs where they can do analysis and inquiry and figure out why things are happening the way they are. Artistic types are the creative types, who like to create and express. Self-expression is a critical part of where they get their satisfaction. Social types are the helpers. They like to be in jobs where they can help others. teaching, for example. Enterprising are the types that like to be action-oriented with people, like persuading people, leading them, sales, marketing. And conventional types, those like to organize. They like to put things into structures. And the labels themselves relate to the labels that the theory is based on. Now, those green labels basically are the original labels of Holland's theory. The names themselves can be a little misleading. So underneath you see in quotes sort of kind of what they refer to in case the term conventional is misleading or realistic, because they're not using the term in the typical way. When you give an employee the strong, the profile comes up and it basically evaluates those 6 personality types. And here's an example of the page on the profile that will help you see, how you prioritize the 2 or 3 types that would define someone's primary interest areas and personality type. What the strong does is not just look at how people rate themselves, but also how they compare to a general reference sample of employed adults in the United States. And so there are numbers attached to it and labels that basically indicate how high is that person on that particular type compared to workers in the United States, and particularly related to their own gender. The second part of the strong is called the basic interest scales. It looks at what do you like? What are your general interest areas? What content areas do you want to be engaged in your work and in your leisure time? And there are about 30 different areas that are summarized here that help someone prioritize what are those content areas that are most interesting to me, that are most likely to lead to my engagement and my satisfaction. So you see, for example, they're grouped according to the 6 personality types. And so under the enterprising type, for example, you'll find sales. Under the investigative type at the very end, you'll see like research and science kind of content areas. The third part of the inventory, and probably the heart of it, are the occupational scales. And these are the scales that actually compare the employee to happily employed people in a variety of occupations. And these scales help identify who it is you share a lot in common with. And so they compare your results of the inventory to happily employed people in over 100 different occupations. And this allows you to understand who you have commonalities with. You share the same things that you like, you share the same things that you dislike. So that if you're high on one of these scales toward the right side of the graph, then those are occupations that may appeal to you because they appeal to people like you. So they don't measure whether you said you were interested in that job. In fact, the strength of the strong is really people often don't know what's out there. They don't know the range of jobs. They know themselves, and they know what they like. And what the scale does is compare them to people who are actually in those jobs, happy in those jobs, successful at them, and compare to how similar they are or dissimilar they are to those people. So even if they may not want to go into that particular occupation, they may want to work with people who are in those fields because they share a lot in common. And the final part of the strong are the personal style scales. These are somewhat similar to the Myers-Briggs in that they get at your work style in sort of your day-to-day activities, your learning style, your leadership style, risk-taking, and your team orientation. And they're in polarities in terms of not whether you have it or don't have it, but what style you use in approaching each of those dimensions. Okay, that's a very brief, quick overview of the strong. Let me give you a brief overview of the Myers-Briggs, even briefer, assuming you know a little bit about the Myers-Briggs. The Myers-Briggs is an indicator basically on 4 different preferences or dichotomies. So it's a personality inventory that really looks at your preferences for approaching each of these different dimensions. The first being extroversion, introversion, and that is whether you tend to focus your attention inwardly or outwardly. Extroversion, more out in the world around you, noticing things around you. Introversion, more in your head, more inside, more active in your mind. That's where you focus your energy. The second dimension, sensing versus intuition, really looks at how you prefer to gather information. Do you prefer to use detail and use your senses to gather all the detail? Or do you prefer to look at connections, intuition between things, look at the bigger picture rather than the detail is what you gather information on? The third dimension, thinking and feeling, looks at how you put that information together and make a decision, come to conclusions about things, whether you use logic and thinking or whether you tend to use feeling and values as the basis for that. And the fourth one, judging and perceiving, really gets at how you go about your daily activities. Do you like to get things decided, make a judgment on them and move on? Or do you like keeping the door open a little bit, gathering more information before you decide and making sure you have all the information first? Maybe put off the decision a little bit. Now, they're listed as dichotomies. All of us, of course, do all of these on either end at different times and in different situations. And what the Myers-Briggs helps us do is to identify what's our preferred way of being, what's our preferred style. Once we identify our style on each of those dimensions, we can then look at how they combine, and it gives us a 4-letter type, and there are 16 different types of personality types that we can that make up the Myers-Briggs. So you can see here a listing of the 16 types. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that than this, and when you look at the case study, we'll get back to this in more detail. Okay. So let's take a case study of how you might use both the Strong and the Myers-Briggs with an unmotivated, unengaged employee. So here's the case study of Sam, an unmotivated Silicon Valley employee. And so I'll read this through with you. Sam is a manager in a Silicon Valley company. Okay? He has an advanced degree in computer science, and he has a history of successful projects and interpersonal relationships in the company. But over the past year, has become increasingly apathetic and withdrawn in meetings. Okay? So he has a new boss. The new boss is autocratic, self-promoting, and as a result, Sam's work has become more routine, and several of his team members have left because of the change. Sam is still putting in long hours and completing his assignments. He's very diligent. He's trying really hard to be engaged, but he's much less and less engaged in his work. He's going through the motions. He's begun to look for other jobs with a headhunter, but he hasn't found anything yet that excites him. So he set up a meeting with a career development professional, and that was me, so I'm talking about actually a real case that I've disguised, to help him identify what factors might lead him to greater engagement. So he completes both the Strong and the Myers-Briggs as a way to assess how quickly can we get to know Sam and help him with this. Okay, so what do his results show? On the Strong, his primary personality types were investigative and artistic. The investigative, again, are the thinkers, really liking analysis, liking to figure out why things work the way they do. So you wouldn't be surprised, absolutely, because you'd say, well, he's in computer science, he has an advanced degree, he's working for a high-tech company, our stereotype, of course, these are investigative types. What we might not have expected is that he's also, his secondary type, or equally primary, the two, is artistic. He really likes creativity and self-expression. And those two together, when you look at the Strong, you don't just take one of the 6 types. You try to look at what are the top 2 or the top 3, because they give you a combination that's critical and help him to see what are the patterns of interest that will be important for him to get met in his job and in his career if he's going to be engaged. On his highest basic interest scales, those are the 30 basic interest domains, his highest were science, programming, and medical science. So again, you see there's that technical and scientific interests that are coming up there. His highest occupational scales, who does he look like? Who does he share a lot in common with? Well, his 3 highest were architect, physicist, and photographer. Again, if we look at what's the commonalities among those 3 occupations, we see there's, again, a technical, but a creative. Those 2 themes coming up again. And in terms of his personal styles, he looks reserved, he's a low risk taker, and he's team-oriented. Okay, so he's kind of a quiet guy. He's not taking a lot of risks. He wants to play it safe. but he likes working in teams. So we have his interests. And we can look at how those fit with a work environment, but we don't really yet have a good understanding of where is his personal style focus. Okay, how does he want to go about his daily activities? Where's that deeper sort of personality process piece? Well, the Myers-Briggs, he comes up as an INFP. Now, INFPs focus on what could be, contribute ideas worth striving for, okay, have empowerment as a goal, and ask questions about how it will be communicated and who it will impact. So you see in the INFP some similar themes that came up on the Strong. That first, focusing on what could be, those ideas, is that creative piece of him. Okay? And also, how it will be communicated, what will be its impact. That feeling part of the Myers-Briggs, is similar to his team orientation on the Strong. So for those of you who aren't as clear on the Myers-Briggs, let me just review the INFP briefly. The introversion, again, is he's wanting to get away, getting energy from reflecting on his ideas, real internal. His intuition on the big picture, future possibilities. Feeling, making decisions that are really value-based. And perceiving, going about his day in a way that's flexible and spontaneous. Okay. Now, when someone might just use the Myers-Briggs alone and look at just this INFP, you might read this and say, well, this is someone, who might work in a social service area or who might be into counseling. They're feeling-oriented. They like working with people and ideas, and may not think, if they hadn't used the Strongs, this is a real technical person who really wants to work in the science areas, programming areas, and technical areas. So putting them together, actually, is really helpful. The INFP, general preference in work environments, they tend to be committed to their ideals, deeply held values, okay? And they like work that contributes to personal growth of themselves and others. And they enjoy solving problems, okay, using a person-centered approach. So when you combine the Strong and the Myers-Briggs, you'd want an environment that would allow Sam basically to take research in innovative directions. Okay? It's that N on the Myers-Briggs and the investigative on the Strong. Facilitate consensus when making decisions. Okay? That's that F part of the Myers-Briggs, and a team orientation on the Strong. Consider the personal impact of ideas, similar. And adapting well to change, that perceptive on the Myers-Briggs. So he's not someone who's rigid. In fact, when he got a new boss, and the boss was very rigid, he adapted. He continued to work really long hours and to try to produce, but he just wasn't engaged. So what was the professional development plan for Sam? Well, Sam began doing informational interviews with other teams in the company, and he used his assessment results to identify a number of projects that had a strong focus on creative innovation. So his homework was to really go around and do informational interviews with other team leads. It was a large Silicon Valley company. They did a lot of different kind of work. And as he talked with them, he took his highlights from his Strong and his Myers-Briggs, and he asked them questions. Is this a team that really would allow me to have a role in being creative and innovative? And he rated them. Which ones came up as really showing that they had potential for that? He also looked at the style of the leadership of the team leads. How did they go about making decisions? Were they autocratic and basically saying, this is what you're going to do, produce by next week the following, and report back? Or did they have more of a consensus style? Did they really have a team approach? Now, one of the things on his Myers-Briggs and his Strong that may be confusing to you is that on the one hand, you think of people who are introverted on the Strong, on the Myers-Briggs, and investigative on the Strong, and would not be team-oriented. You think, oh, they're working alone. That's our stereotype. But actually, he was someone who had both. He showed an introverted preference on the Myers-Briggs, but also a team orientation on his work style on the Strong. So here's someone who liked to work in his head, liked to work alone, and then come back and be a team member and talk with the team members and refine ideas. So it was really that go back on your own, do your work, come to a team, and work together, which using both tools together was ideal in helping him identify. Okay, so where did he go? Well, Sam applied for a transfer to another team. He found one that was a biotech focus, which helped him, if you remember his Strong, he looked like physicists. He looked like these technical types, and he had a high interest in science. So he found himself really energized by a team that actually had content of science. And he could use his computer science training actually to help the scientists with their work. And in that team, he was highly regarded after he settled in. I had a follow-up interview with him to see how it went. And he said they really respected his creativity, and he found that he was highly productive but an independent contributor to the team. He brought something different that he could go back and do, and the team members really appreciated. And he loved that it was a collaborative group. They liked working together, and the leader pulled them together. So it was a nice way to see how you can use assessment tools to pull together those critical aspects that are going to lead to engagement for an employee who's on his way out the door. So combining the Strong and the Myers-Briggs, you can use it for a number of different things. And here's a list of some examples. You use both actually to identify work tasks, those that are going to be more satisfying to the individual. You use it to identify work environments that are going to be a good fit. You can also use it for specific job titles and occupations to be satisfying. So in Sam's example, he was able to use the science as a way to think of titles, what teams would be dealing with science, to help him funnel down and identify in this large organization the content area that would help. For many people, it's also looking at leisure and balance in life, not looking for everything to be satisfied through your job, and actually identifying activities that you're interested in that aren't getting met in your job, that you can get met outside, and that will fuel you and give you more energy during the day while you're working. Also use both inventories to look at strategies and plans for career development, and I'll be giving another example for that in a minute. And tactics for staying motivated during a job hunt or a transition. So for example, you saw in Sam's profile on the Strong, he was a low risk taker. When it came time to look for another job, he was someone who was very unlikely to take a risk and go out and talk with people. He was very unlikely to think about another job. He was just going to stay and be unhappy because it was safe, it was familiar. And so by using the instruments, I could help him identify that that was his style of not taking any risks, but in order to get to the next step, he needed help in making it safer so that he could take the next risk. And so talking with me about how to do informational interviewing, how to make the next step concrete, made it more safe. And he was able to go forward in his job hunt and his transition. So the tactics on how to do that, how to go about the process, even the job search itself, never mind the content of the job, is a useful strategy for using the Strong and the Myers-Briggs. Okay, that was an individual approach, and many of you may work with individuals, and that might be one example of how you'd use both of those instruments. Another is if you're in a role where you're, say, in a human resources department, and you're trying to develop a career development program. One of the things you may consider is using assessment tools such as the Strong and the Myers-Briggs as an assessment base for coaching and for career development of employees in general. And here's an example from Nokia. This is a company that decided that they would develop a personal assessment center for all new employees, so that instead of approaching career development from a series of seminars that they would offer on career development, they decided to put everybody through a personal assessment center. Okay, using formal assessment tools, they used the Strong and the Myers-Briggs as the foundation for their career development program. And what they did is they had all new employees complete both the Strong and the MBTI. Okay? And the reason they did that is they had a workforce that was mobile and geographically dispersed around the world. So it was difficult to actually pull them as individuals into one physical space and do a workshop and have interactions. So they needed an approach that actually would help them connect with people on an individual basis an individual differences basis depending on where they were working, because people were in very different work environments, both in terms of their jobs but also geographically. They also could take the assessments online. And the advantage of both the Strong and the Myers-Briggs is they both now can be completed online, and actually the results can be delivered to the employee online, and you don't need to actually meet with the person in the same space. The other advantage is that confidentiality is assured in using these tools because they can be stored outside of the company. And so this company said, well, one of the barriers to using assessments is that people are going to be worried that their manager or their supervisor is going to have access to their records. And if we're keeping them in a file in HR, what can assure them that no one is looking at that? And how can they answer the inventory honestly when they're taking it, if they have that in their mind? Whereas using both the Strong and the Myers-Briggs, you go to a website, you have the results sent to the student, to the employee. I do with a lot of students as well. And the confidentiality is taken away from any centralized file. And you deliver the results online with phone coaching. So both the Myers-Briggs and the Strong still require some intervention by a career coach or a career counselor to help interpret the results and help point out highlights and help the employee not overinterpret some things and help them sort through all the information. But that can be done with phone. You don't have to have it as an in-person now that you can share online the profile and look at it together. And it helps for each employee to have a tailored career development plan so that with each one, like we did with Sam, you can find, what are the critical aspects of their interests and what are their personality styles, and how does that fit with the job they've been assigned, the job they're just starting? Where are the gaps for where they need to improve for job satisfaction looking ahead? And for each person, it's going to be a different plan. And these are, I think, ideal tools to do it. So that's just one approach, that's an assessment approach for employee development that can be done on a wider scale. Okay, so let me summarize. I want to leave a good amount of time for questions. All of us are likely to be more satisfied and productive if we're working at something we enjoy, in an environment that allows us to work in ways that are compatible with our personality, strengths, and preferences. Right? Okay, giving you a lot of information and a very brief overview of some relatively complicated tools. So let me open it up for questions at this point. And Larry, are you? I'm not getting any feedback.
Larry, I don't know if you're on the phone still, but we can't hear you if you're talking.
Can't hear Larry.
I'm still not hearing Larry. I'm not sure what's happening.
Okay.
Larry, if you want to try to dial back in,
Jeff,
I will go ahead and get, oh, I can hear you.
I'm not sure what happened there.
Me neither. That's so weird. Okay, carry on.
Sorry about that, folks. So thank you very much, Jeff. I do have some questions here. The first one being a question from Stephen, and that is how, excuse me, that threw me off. The questions are rolling in now. How can a manager use and or apply the Strong and MBTI for retention of their entire staff and individual employees for getting their employees more engaged in their work?
I'm sorry, Larry, I had some interference there. Could you reread that again?
Sure. How can a manager use and apply the Strong and MBTI for retention of their entire staff and individual employees for getting their employees more engaged in their work?
So the question is how to engage a whole staff, and I think the example I gave about that company was one where they actually had everyone, all new employees, go through the individual assessment. I think for many organizations, it's really helpful to use a group approach. And you do end up having to sacrifice some of the sort of confidentiality or openness that people might have to sharing their results in a group. But you can do groups in a way that really protect people's profiles, where you don't require them to share their results, but you can do a workshop format where you present the information about the profiles section by section and have people ask questions, divide them into small dyads where they can have discussion about their results. And I find that very effective. And for large groups, it's often impractical to assume you have the resources to do one-on-one interpretations with them. But there are a number of resources that in guidebooks that you can use that CPP produces that actually walks you through step by step with how to do those kinds of workshops. We'll give you a script on how to go through the presentation, as well as some pointers on how to manage unusual profiles that you might encounter.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. The next question is from Jessica, and it is, in the case study, was Sam's employer aware that he sought help? Did the employer embrace this exploration, or was this something he was doing on his own before applying for the transfer?
He was afraid of, he started by going to his human resources group, and there was a career counselor there that met with him a couple of times. And then he did nothing. He was really afraid to move forward. And so then he reached out privately, I'd say a couple months later, at some prompting by friends to say, you got to move on this, and contacted me individually. So that it wasn't that he was afraid that his employer would learn that he was dissatisfied. He did trust, actually, the career development office in the organization for its confidentiality. But I think he was such a low risk person that he was really just afraid of moving on. And when he made a couple of steps, he stepped back. And there was something about, for him, I think, working privately with somebody that helped him feel a little freer to engage and to talk more honestly. But it wasn't because there was anything the organization did that compromised the confidentiality.
Great. Okay. The next question is from Sharon, and it is, does a person's experience influence the strong results? Would it differ in your 20s from your 40s?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at your interests, it's the same with both the strong, and the Myers-Briggs. You're going to find some changes over time, depending on development and depending on experiences you've had. With the strong, one of the developmental issues you need to be aware of is you're working with younger people. I'd say, if they're 18, 19 years old, often their interests, even 20, 21, their interests are going to continue to develop. Most of the research shows that our interests solidify by the time we're 30. And so your interest patterns at 30 tend to be pretty stable, barring unusual life events that might change them. But the themes are going to be relatively the same. But if you're working with younger employees who are like maybe just out of high school, using the strong, you want to really focus on the fact that, we're going to look at this in a general way, take out some general themes, but also be open that they may change as you get more experience and more exposure to the world of work. So yeah, age does vary on that. But in fact, the research shows that if you stay with the general themes, you can use it with actually very young people and still highly valid.
Excellent. And the next question is from John. What standard did Nokia assess against to determine the new employees' gaps?
The standard, as I understand it, and I'm not as familiar with the details, so I may be misrepresenting it, but my understanding was that what they did is they looked at, for each person, what is it they wanted? Looking at their personality and their interests, kind of where did they want to go in their individual career plan, and then where was their job right now? What was the career ladder kind of in front of them as well? And looked at, to get where they wanted to go from where their current job is, what would be the kinds of things that they would want to get more experience with in order to get there. And so the tools actually were looking at both their current job as well as their personal career goals.
Great. And the next question is from Helene. She asks, has there been overlap or correlation with MBTI style and the Strong assessment?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research that has compared your Strong results and your Myers-Briggs results. And the research is pretty clear in showing that they're measuring different dimensions. And there are some correlations. That is, sometimes certain scores go up on the Strong, tend to go up on certain scales on the Myers-Briggs, but the reality is for everybody it's somewhat different. And so you can't actually map them and say you can do one instrument or the other. For example, as I was talking about sort of the introversion-extroversion scale, that could be correlated and is correlated with the investigative scale on the Strong, that people who tend to be investigative on the Strong tend to be more on the introverted preference on the Myers-Briggs, but there are many people who are not. And what's fascinating in using them together is you might have the research base to say, yeah, they tend to be correlated, and you can read those correlations, and you find an individual that doesn't fit that model. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because you learn more about them by exploring the scales and how they differ. Because the scales can overlap a bit, but they're really tapping into something independent. And that's why I like to use them together. They provide more depth, I think, when you take one scale on the Strong and another on the Myers-Briggs. So, for example, the artistic scale on the Strong, and then you look at whether they're intuitive on the Myers-Briggs to see if they like looking at things and patterns of things and associations as opposed to facts. And you think, okay, that should fit together. On the other hand, there are many artists on the Strong who have a sensing style on the Myers-Briggs, and they like doing art that's very, very tactual and very tactile and very sensing. So, you really have to understand on each of the instruments what that dimension is measuring. And I think the research that shows their correlations can help you and guide you to think about what you might expect going together. But you really don't need to know that research in order to use them both well, because they're measuring different things.
And Jeff, Drew poses the next question, and that is, how might you consider using this combo with executives who are relatively advanced in their jobs and risk-averse and work for a small company?
Okay, let's see. They're risk-averse. They work for a small company, and they're an executive. I don't see how, I guess I'd have to think about why there are specific issues that would not apply here, because I see that as almost similar to the case study that I presented with Sam. He was relatively high level, although he worked for a large company. And what I find with executives is that these are ideal tools in many ways because you can use them to tap into just one or two things. I mean, they give you so much information. But when you're an executive, you've done a lot, and you have a lot of background to draw on. And what you need help from a career development professional is abstracting from that a theme or two that really will highlight what it is that's going to engage you. And with executives, I find that you don't go through necessarily all the scales. You're not exploring their career at the early end of their phase. You're really looking at how to fine-tune. And so you're trying to diagnose, what is it right now either that's not working, or what is the primary area that's going to lead you to more passion and more energy. And so you use the tool basically with someone like that to help explore and have them tell you kind of what are they responding to on this profile. What's hitting home for them, what's ringing true, and trust them. Don't trust the inventories to diagnose and say this is where you should go. You use them to give them the feedback and to say this is what this is showing. What do you think? And they will tell you. They'll say, yeah, exactly. This is right on point here. This is where I've gotten in trouble in the past, or I've had feedback about this in my 360, or this is a theme I've heard again and again, or this is a passion that I've always had, but it's still there. I've just never paid attention to it. I guess I should wake up. but try to identify just one or two things. I'm not sure if I'm getting at the essence of the question of the small company piece and what would be unique about that, but I'm not sure it matters if it's a small company or a large company. It might be that you really have to look at, what are the options for changing your work if you're not engaged in a small company, reshaping it. If you're risk averse and don't want to try a new company, like the sample in Sam here, is you then look at your opportunities and what you have and what you can help guide the person in thinking through, how can you reshape it to fit you then. Take little risks, start moving in that direction, but keep moving, even if they're not ready to make a big jump.
Thank you, Jeff. And speaking of engagement, we have quite the engaged audience here. The questions just keep coming in, and so we'll address a few more here. The next one is from David, and he asks, I wonder if you can speak to Gallup's strengths-based approach to increasing employee engagement and how it relates to the MBTI/Strong inventory alignment.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully grasp the Gallup strengths-based approach, but I will say that my approach is certainly one that comes from a strengths-based model in general. So I can't speak to Gallup specifically. The way in which both the Myers-Briggs and the Strong are constructed is they're very positive. They come from a more, in modern day language, we'd call it positive psychology. In the older day language, we'd call it strengths-based, building on strengths of people. Neither of these inventories are diagnostic in the sense of looking at deficits, and it's really going through the inventories, looking at the profiles, and especially if you look at some of the interpretive reports, the way in which every score and every pattern of personality or interests are listed, it's from a strength-based model. It's looking at what is it that fits you, what is it you do well, what is it you're drawn toward. It's all about your strengths. And how do you then take those and map them to areas that are going to fit those strengths? So they're actually ideal for that sort of a model. I think it can be harmful to use either of these instruments in a way that looks at deficits and looks at what you don't have, because both on the Myers-Briggs and on the Strong, they're self-report measures. They're not measures that are really getting at deficits. They're not accurate for looking at what's missing. In fact, with experience, often we can actually build our strengths in areas that we don't feel are strong. So, for example, on the Myers-Briggs, you come out on one side or another, but it's based on Jung's theory that over time and through our lives, we should actually be able to become competent in both sides of those polarities, on each of the four polarities. So the ideal is that you're more balanced and can pull on one or the other depending upon the demand of the environment or the situation. Similarly with the Strong, as we go through life, we become more defined and more clear about those aspects of our interests that really grab us and that fit us. But that doesn't mean that the others we're not interested in at all. In fact, if there are some we haven't explored, especially with younger workers, we want to actually say, let's look at your Strong profile here. Maybe it's not showing much interest, or maybe there's some things here that are really sort of showing disinterest. Have you ever even explored them? Because many people endorsing the inventory will say, I don't like it, simply because they're not familiar with it. And often from a strength-based model, it's working with employees to say, try this if you've never tried it. And you might discover an interest you don't even know yet. So they're both, I think, developed from a model that's just great for a strength-based approach.
Thank you, Jeff. And now for our final question. It comes from Gary. How do you treat the themes when they are within a point or two and the client says they are not remotely interested in the top occupations that were triggered by the top theme?
Yeah, that's a great question. Say you're looking at the occupational scales and you see that the top 5, for example, are all within a point or two of each other, and they're all pretty high. So it looks like, you look like, say, Sam did on, you look like the photographers, and you look like the physicists, and you say, but, I'm not interested in photography or architecture or physics. the way in which you interpret the strong is you don't take those occupations as literally these are occupations you should go into. You take it as these are people you share a lot in common with, and that's what it's measuring. And so that you help the person understand that what are the on the one hand, these are the kinds of people you could work with in lots of different ways. But the other way, and I'd say the way I normally approach this as a first approach, is I look at what are the themes behind those top occupations. That is, what are the general occupational themes? And you find, as with Sam, those three were not occupations he was interested in at all. He didn't want to be an architect or a physicist. At his point in his career, he wasn't going to go back and get the training for those. But we could easily see that all those top occupations had in common the investigative and artistic personality interests. And so we could focus on them not as the titles themselves, but on the personality styles that they had in common, and that it was important for him to have an occupation like that would have both the investigative and that artistic component, just as it would be important for a photographer or an architect. So it was easy to go beyond the title with him and look at kind of what were the underlying personality aspects, interest patterns that really he was endorsing there that were critical for him to pay attention to.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for all of your questions. We have taken note of all of those that we were unable to address, and we'll be following up on those. So please know that they have not been noted. They have been duly noted. So thank you very much. For all attendees today, we have designed a special promotion and put together a package of products and support materials with a 10% discount. And those materials include the Strong and MBTI Career Report, specifically the MBTI Career Report, the Career Report User's Guide, and the Introduction to Type and Career Reports booklet. And this discount applies to the electronic materials as well. And as far as the Strong Interest Inventory goes, the Where Do I Go Next booklet is part of this package. To order, please visit our website at www.cpp.com or give us a call. Use the promotion code CAREER12 to secure your savings, and the offer expires October 31st, 2012. Jeff, can you advance to the next slide?
You know, I just switched to a different location because the phone wasn't working.
Oh, okay. And for those folks on the webinar, please visit cpp.com to learn more about the MBTI and the Strong. We have a plethora of resources, including information around certification, sample reports. I do know a lot of questions were posed around learning more and wanting to see the actual reports. So those are downloadable at cpp.com. Of course, you can email us with additional questions following the webinar.
You know, Larry, it's not advancing. I wonder if you could advance it from your end. It's frozen.
Okay, let's take a look here. It is not allowing me to. Kara, are you able to?
I can. Hold on one second. All right. Can we see it?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you. So as I was stating, this is the promotional package that we have put together for everyone, listing all of the products, including the electronic products. and you can visit our website, give us a call, and enter the promotion code CAREER12 to secure those savings. And Kara, if you can advance over. So that brings us to the conclusion. So thank you very much, everyone. Again, here's our website address, our email address for follow-up questions, and as well as our phone number for reaching out to us.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in, everyone.
Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.